Ideas are not experiences. An idea. Why does history repeat? Why does it seem thinkers like Heidegger are at war with language? Why does it seem art has more influence on ideas than ideas on art? And though both have an impact, why does art seem to change the world more so than philosophy, as technology seems to be more consequential than education? Why do words often fail us? Why does the phrase, "I can't put it into words," resonate? Why does knowing things could be worse not make us happier? It's because ideas are not experiences. We seem naturally inclined to forget how wide the gap is between the idea and the experience until the experience, and soon thereafter we forget again, tricked by the impressions of our ideas. And this is life. Furthermore, we know ideas aren't experiences more so than experience it. We never experience this general truth, only particularities of it, such as the idea of rain isn't the experience of rain, the idea of economic collapse isn't the experience of economic collapse, and so forth. This being the case, there is always some idea of some experience which isn't backed by any kind of experience at all for us, and whatever these experiences are, we aren't oriented toward them in the same way we are toward that which we have actually experienced. What is only an idea to us is that which we aren't toward in the same way we are toward an experience, which is also an idea/experience, seeing as what we experience is also that which we will have an idea of, unless, that is, we have amnesia, entirely forget, so forth and so on. Unlikely circumstances that, though possible, don't change the point of this paper. Considering this, seeing as what you are reading right now is really only an idea to you, it is unlikely that this paper will influence you as strongly as whatever you will experience soon after you finish reading, for better or for worse. Ideas are not experiences is an idea, and even if we know it is true, this will not impact us as we'll experience what we know is true. And herein lies the truth for why history repeats, why writers often feel like failures, and why Aquinas felt like all he had done was straw. To be told what others have experienced is to be told what we can never, in particular, experience, that which will never fit us. And the expressors not only knows this, but experiences the failure in the act of trying. Yes, we may experience a different sunset, religious vision, eureka, and so forth, but we can never experience that sunset, religious vision, eureka, and so forth, which we are told about. At best, if we've had similar experiences, we can connect, but to connect with what I have experienced isn't to experience it. I am alone with what I want to share, perhaps burdened. And if burdened, I am motivated to try to share, to be freed, to try to get better at writing, singing, painting, storytelling, and so forth, to create worlds that aren't real worlds, to do things that others might find crazy, but ideas are not experiences. Section 1. Humans are not merely brains on sticks. We are bodily creatures who also feel, touch, and so on. As a result, though both are indeed real, there is a sense in which the experience of a sunset is more real to us than the idea of a sunset, or at least that's how it feels, seeing as experiences are more fitting for our ontology, which, if we were indeed just brains on sticks, mere ideas would be more fitting. As a result, experiences are more influential and motivational to us than our ideas. We simply aren't impacted by ideas the same way we are by experiences. This doesn't mean ideas don't impact us at all, and I agree with Dietrich McCloskey that ideas are primarily responsible for the incredible enrichment of humanity, starting notably after the 1800s. Ideas can change the world, and every day in schools around the country this fact is proven, similar to the arguments of probable cause by O.G. Rose. My point is simply that, to make an example, the idea that bullying is bad isn't as likely to motivate the majority of people to actively stop bullying as will an actual experience of being bullied. Problematically, if the majority won't be motivated to keep X experience from happening until X experience happens, then especially democratic societies require experiences to avoid those experiences, which is, of course, when it's too late, and so history repeats. We simply can't be influenced by the ideas on experiences the same way we can be influenced by a given experience, and this hints at why history repeats. Knowing the causes of historical events will not motivate us like experiencing those causes, which, if we experience, are likely too far advanced to stop. And yet, we cannot experience history. At best, we can visit recreations, only read about it and hence understand it in terms of ideas, which may counterproductively make us feel like we do understand history, making us overconfident. Considering this, the act of studying history to avoid repeating it can contribute to the likelihood that we fail to avoid the mistakes of history. This logic applies to all mistakes in general. Knowing we shouldn't do X is to possess an idea that is likely to prove weak when faced with the experience-based temptation to do X. And having possessed an idea about X, being overconfident, we have failed to adequately prepare ourselves. But how could we prepare for what we don't know about? If we don't know that X causes Y and Y is bad, how could we know we need to avoid X or even what constitutes X? Without ideas about X, we seem destined to commit X, but the mere idea we shouldn't do X is never as strong as the experience of the temptation to do X, and in fact, the idea may make us weaker via overconfidence. It seems we are destined to prove weak, to stop mistakes from being recommitted, as we seem weak to not give in to the despair that arises when we try to articulate experiences into the ideas that experiences can never be. Section 2. Ideas are not experiences. If today we are recommitting the mistakes of the Roman Empire, we aren't likely to know this as strongly as we would if we could experience the fall of Rome, an impossibility. We don't learn from history because we don't feel history, only conceptualize it, and so it goes with many things in life. Only the artist, for example, experiences that initial idea that stimulated his or her project, and no matter how perfect the project in capturing the experience, the project is never the experience. Yes, experiencing the project is itself a perhaps powerful experience, but the experience of the project is never the experience of the idea, inspiration, vision, emotion, so on, which motivated the project. So it goes with the experience that motivates a person to avoid relationships, the experience that causes a person to suffer depression, and so on. And yet if a person tells you, I avoid relationships because my husband, who I trusted with my life, cheated on me, it will seem to be the case that you know what the person experienced. But they told you, you know. And in a world that is still rightly or wrongly deeply Cartesian, a world that believes what a person thinks is the primary ingredient in who a person is, though we may say, I don't know what you are going through, it's hard for this humble thought not to immediately fall back away into consciousness where it is forgotten. It's as if we just can't remember for long that the idea of X isn't the same as the experience of X, until we again are asked directly, moments after which the thought falls away again. It should be noted that the reason ideas are useful is precisely because they are not experiences, in the same way that a map is useful because it is not an exact replication of the territory mapped, was shown in The Exactitude of Science by Borges. If ideas were experiences, we would all be delusional, existing in two worlds at once that we couldn't distinguish. The ideas would be incomprehensible, and we wouldn't likely survive for long, rendered unable to function by our minds. If ideas are overly correct, they would prove useless in the same way scientific models prove useless that are too precise and too detailed. In the same way works of art prove meaningless when they are too realistic and like the ordinary lives and world we already live in. Yet scientific models that are too imprecise, like art that is too abstract and difficult to relate to, are also useless and meaningless. And so a difficult middle ground has to be found, as must be found between ideas and experiences in general. All models are wrong, but some are useful, to allude to George Box's famous warning. But to be useful, models can't be overly correct and or overly precise, a point which is rarely easy to determine. The more intelligent the person, the more creative the artist, the more difficult it is to be overly correct, precisely because to avoid this error, the person has to leave out data, details, so forth, that the person knows are relevant. The person has to accept being incorrect, not wrong, but not fully right, an act which can be painful and feel like a disservice to the person's calling, profession, and the like. We also tend to be overly correct to avoid problems of misinterpretation, loopholes, criticisms, and so on, but to avoid these problems, we have to become more technical and precise, as especially evident in legal writing, which ironically makes our works increasingly useless. Though there's a real sense in which if the works can be misinterpreted, they are useless. We seem caught. If in the past we have been criticized for not being nuanced enough, leaving out relevant data, not addressing X, Y, and Z, and so forth, as we can always be so criticized unless our maps are their territories, emotionally hurt, we are even more likely to be overly correct and hence makes our works increasingly useless. Something else for which we can be criticized. From criticism to criticism, we can come to feel trapped, swaying emotionally like a pendulum between saying too much and saying too little, between being overly correct and useless and being incorrect and criticized, and so we face the problem of technicality versus usefulness. If I tell my child to go to bed, and I later go upstairs and the child is in bed playing a video game, did my child do what I instructed? Technically, yes, and yet at the same time, no. I, in meaning, told the child to go to sleep, but in not using a precise language, I left open a loophole, rendering what I said useless, in a sense. My child has disobeyed me, and yet hasn't. To avoid this loophole in the future, I will likely use a more technical and precise language and say, go to sleep. But then later I may find my child asleep at a friend's house, and my son may protest that I didn't tell him where to sleep. Again, my child has been disobedient, and yet not. To avoid this, I may use an even more technical language to avoid even more possible loopholes, and eventually my language will be so precise and technical that it may not only be impractical, but also incomprehensible. To try to take away from my child the possibility of disobeying me and yet not disobeying me, of providing my child with a reasonable space to which to misunderstand me. I may have to speak in a manner that my child cannot understand. And if my child doesn't understand me, my child can't follow my instruction to go to bed. To avoid all loopholes, to avoid all ways to interpret what I say in a manner that my child could innocently use to his advantage and claim reasonably was a fair interpretation, I would have to speak so technically and precisely that I would render my language useless, if not meaningless. This problem of technicality versus usefulness hints at why intellectuals can speak and write in jargon about matters that are too precise for average people to care about, and why laws and taxes are so difficult to understand. Simultaneously, this problem hints at why no matter how technical works become, intellectuals can still find a problem in the creator's academic work, and lawyers can still find loopholes that benefit their clients. Academics and legislators want to avoid being incorrect, and in failing to accept that to some degree they must be incorrect, as artists must to some degree fail to capture their visions, academics and legislators articulate themselves out of relevance, except perhaps amongst themselves. But can we blame them? Laws that leave open loopholes have real, practical, and even dire impacts, and academics who fail to avoid being incorrect can lose tenure. Technicality is necessary for them and for practical meaning, but regardless, writing that is overly correct is not only still wrong, but useless. All articulation is wrong, but some is useful. But if it is useful, there are likely technicalities that can be exploited for the sake of creating loopholes and/or that disagreeing academics can write articles countering. This is perhaps why academics often seem locked in an endless discussion with themselves, as can seem lawyers, and for the useful and the fully correct are two lines that can never touch, meaning there is always something to criticize and write counter articles against. As the necessary gap between useful and fully correct is why the endless back and forth happens, so the necessary gap between idea and experience seems to be why history repeats without hope of stopping. The endless repetition seems sewn into the nature of being, and yet since it is not directly forced, there always seems to be the possibility of escape. As in a field surrounded by fences, there always seems to be the possibility of freedom. Repetition isn't forced, but practically forced. Section 3. All thoughts are models, and all models are wrong. Hence, all ideas fail to be experienced, as all maps fail to be territories, but some are good. Like the gap between thinking and perceiving, as discussed in On Thinking and Perceiving by O.G. Gross, so there is a gap between ideas and experiences, and as thinking quickly consumes a perception, something we sense, as if the perception was always a thought, making it seem like the two were always one, so ideas quickly consume an experience, hiding the gap between idea and experience. Yes, we know the gap is there, but a kind of automatic forgetfulness seems built into the human mind. Remembering is unnatural, as is avoiding the repetition of historic mistakes. Doing today what we know we need to do to avoid future catastrophes, and so on. Because ideas aren't experiences, we can use them, but this is always also why it seems practically inevitable that history repeats, that artists and thinkers find themselves at war with language and their works, that art is more influential than ideas, that words fail us, that we are tempted by whole hope, as discussed in the paper Whole Hope, that we be susceptible to confirmation bias and deception via evidence, that we have to work to make sure we don't just love an idea of a person, but an actual person, that we swing between supporting one political party until they are in office and we experience them, and then support the other party until we experience them in office, over and over again, and so on. But what would a world look like in which it was improbable and practically inevitable that history repeated, that artists and thinkers and so on? Well, it would be a world in which our minds were useless to us. If ideas weren't incorrect, they would likely destroy us. Because of the tragedy sown into being, we are not doomed, even if we are practically doomed. Ideas aren't experiences, and yet it seems in our nature to forget this and fall into grave errors. And yet without ideas, there would be no creativity, no technology, no civilization, and the quality of human life would lower. Without maps, we would be lost. Without GPS, we would struggle how to find where we wanted to go. Maps, like ideas, are invaluable, but at the same time, like ideas in a sense, maps are flat while territories are 3D. A map can make it look like it will take a few minutes to travel from one point to another, when in reality we find on the territory that it takes 3 hours. Likewise, our idea of marriage can make it seem that the secret to a happy marriage is easy. Just communicate. But when in marriage, we can find it's much harder than our idea led us to believe. And how do we communicate? What do we say? The problem isn't ideas in of themselves, but our natural tendency to forget, though we know when asked directly that the act of knowing isn't in of itself enough, and by extension our natural tendency to become overconfident about X because of knowledge about X. The main mistakes seem to be 1. Confusing maps with territories. 2. Believing that ownership of a map is as good as exploring the territory. 3. Being overconfident in our ability to explore and understand the territory because we have a map. 4. Trying to create a map that is the territory in order to avoid any mistakes. 5. Not having a map at all and or not thinking we need one. Indeed, to use Wittgenstein's wordplay, confusing ideas with experiences, believing knowing X is as good as experience X, being overconfident thanks to intelligence, trying to make ideas so technical that they capture everything about the territory, and or not valuing ideas at all of these are dire mistakes. We require ideas, and hence we cannot avoid the risk of making one of the mistakes listed here, unless it is we accept being stupid and at the mercy of chance. The question isn't if we should think, we will, but how we should think and in what way. As discussed in other works by O.G. Rose, a humbler kind of thinking is needed, one that fights against itself to keep in focus its limits and to remain open to being corrected by experience and high-order complexity, for that matter, as discussed in Experiencing Thinking by O.G. Rose. As discussed in On Critical Thinking, we need thinking that maintains a criticism, like a movie critic, of how thinking structures reality toward us, and so on. The main point is that the problem isn't thinking itself, but rather our failure to critique our thinking and engage in epistemic humility, a theme throughout O.G. Rose. The point is to recognize that thinking and knowing alone are not enough, and to recognize that thinking and knowing alone are not enough is itself an idea that will prove weak before the experience of our minds making us think the opposite. Section 4. To allude to girdle, there is an incompleteness that is indivisible from being, as there is an uncorrectness that is indivisible from maps and models. Accepting this makes it easier to write, to produce art, and so on, without being overly correct or falling into despair, as does accepting the tragic nature of being, discussed in The Fragility of Goodness by Martha Nussbaum. And yet ideas, maps, and models that are too wrong, that make the error of being vaguely correct, also prove useless, and how to find the middle road isn't easy, and it is especially difficult when we forget, because of the automatic forgetting that seems indivisible from consciousness itself, that we even need to find this middle way. We must accept ideas are not experiences, and yet not cease trying to capture experiences in ideas. We must flirt with despair and failure. In closing, ideas are experience but not experiences. Experiences are what the word experiences isn't, and though we know that reading about X, hearing about X, and so on isn't the same as experiencing X, ideas are all we have, and compared to experiences, they are weak. This is why people can genuinely believe, knowing X is what must be done to stop Y, that if they were in a position of power, they would stand against the resistance and do X, and yet why it is that when those genuine people come into power, they often fail to do X. Knowing that X action can lead to Y consequence in the past is an idea that is highly unlikely to motivate and impact us as deeply as will the experience of the resistance to X, making it probable that we will back down and Y consequence will occur. When faced with resistance to X, the idea that ideas on experiences is especially likely to fall away in consciousness, bearing hope in the likelihood that X will be done. And yet before we face resistance to X, the knowing we should do X is likely to make us feel like we will do X when we need to do it, making us unprepared. Before we are faced with an experience of resistance to X, we have no reason to think that we won't do X, only an idea that doing X will cause us to face resistance, which will feel equal with the idea of doing X, and so we're likely caught off guard, and so the repetition of the mistakes of history are practically inevitable. We can encounter a person who is married, but we cannot ever experience ourselves married before we are, and hence only have an idea of what it's like to be married. Thanks to the idea, we can both be more prepared and less prepared for actual marriage. The question is how we use this idea, and if we use it in the humble manner described in this paper, we must all learn to engage in epistemic humility, or otherwise there is even less chance we will avoid the mistakes that are consequence of failing to remember that ideas aren't experiences. Mistakes that already seem likely to be made over and over again. Ideas aren't experiences. The obvious is why we are able to function, and why we fail to function well. Is there any hope? Perhaps. But perhaps not if we continue to have new ideas. This has been O.G. Rose. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook. Please follow us on YouTube, and thank you for your time.